Okay, since our numbers are beginning to stabilize, let me welcome you all here, wherever here is now and whatever here means now. My name is Eric Kleinenberg. I'm the director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, also a professor of sociology at NYU. Over the last several weeks, with the collaboration and support from the Cross-Cutting Initiative on Inequality at NYU and also IPK, we have hosted a series of conversations about the pandemic and inequality, and taken on a range of topics, including public goods and health disparities, the protests that were related to the pandemic in ways that we explored. Tonight, we are going to be discussing a really urgent question for all of us who live in New York City, but of course for people all over the world, and that is the fate of cities moving forward. And COVID has been such a complex and difficult to understand problem that you surely remember when the pandemic first became a crisis in the US, and the story was it was hitting New York City the hardest. And so the punditry declared that the pandemic was an urban phenomenon, and that one clear lesson from it was that density was dangerous, that shared public facilities were dangerous, and that this would augur in a new period of development where, with the Cold War, people would flee central cities out of fear of vulnerability, and surge into the suburbs and change our patterns of living. Of course, COVID spread far beyond central cities. It turns out there was extraordinary variation in how central cities fared from COVID. Some people did move to the suburbs, but a whole bunch of people moved back to the city. And now cities across the United States and many other parts of the world as well are experiencing new booms in the real estate market. And so much of the story is up for grabs. Here in the United States, it was in fact a set of elections in Georgia for Senate that determined much of the fate of US cities, because when the Senate became controlled by the Democrats, suddenly there was a possibility of getting funding to bail out public transit and other public works in states that are highly urbanized, including the one that we live in, New York. And so, by a hair, the fate of the urban in the United States seemed to have turned. But of course, this is not a settled question in any way. And one of the things that we have discussed throughout our series on the pandemic and our series on this moment is that while this is a scary moment in many ways, we are still in the grips of the pandemic, a fourth surge, and we don't know when it's going to end. It is also in many ways an exhilarating moment because for the first time in our lifetimes, many of us have this feeling that everything is up for grabs, and that our future could turn in any number of directions, from repressive and authoritarian to liberatory, emancipatory and green. And so we want this conversation and our debates in the series to be pitched towards that. Enough from me. We have 4 of NYU's great urban scholars here tonight. Sally Angel from the Marin School, Kimberly Johnson from Metropolitan Studies and Social Cultural Analysis Department, Vanessa Dean from Wagner and Urban Planning, and Tom Sugru from Metropolitan Studies, SCA, and also the History Department. I've asked each of our speakers to go for about 10 minutes. We'll then mix it up and have some conversation. Feel free to ask a question at any time by using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll field the questions and we'll get them in at the end. So you can enter them at any moment, but we won't get to them until the end. We're going to go for about an hour tonight and get you all back to your lives. You can get off this screen and go on to another Zoom call when we're done. You can go crazy if you like. So with that, Sally, nice to see you. Good to have you here. Why don't you kick us off?
Thank you, Eric, for the kind introduction. I would like to speak today about 6 emerging trends that we could say will strengthen in cities after COVID. The first one is that the retail revolution has gathered speed. The retail revolution was accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Both reduced the demand for retail space in central cities. No one in his right mind would sign a 10-year lease on a retail property today. It's all up in arms. And there's reduced demand for retail space as more people shop online. And that is already lowering retail prices. There are a lot of vacancies, and it may make it possible, on the positive side, for newcomers and innovators to enter the retail scene. The second pattern is the acceleration of online work. A McKinsey report estimates that the number of full-time equivalents of central city jobs may decline by as much as 25% if people can work from home, let's say 1 or 2 days per week. This would mean a reduced demand for restaurants, bars, and other services, and reduced employment for the people who worked in these services. It could also mean a change in office organization to warm desks and a consequent decline in the demand for office space, again, by as much as 25%, which would be huge. The decline would also lead to a decline in the tax base and has very critical fiscal implications for cities. It may also lead to the reorganization of suburban homes to create more privatized space within the home for work. It could also mean a reduction in commuting traffic and the easing of traffic congestion, or could also mean a decline in office, retail, and housing prices, making central cities more affordable and more attractive to the creative class, to lower income people that earlier found central cities unaffordable. And this could also change demographics of cities for the better, making them more diverse, both in terms of income, in terms of the kinds of work, and in terms of ethnicity. And finally, it could also make cities more inviting to immigrants. The third pattern that we see is that mass transit has been dealt a serious blow. Transit agencies took a real hit when transit went to almost zero during the pandemic. This generated major losses, but it also led to a shift of resources from investments to operating expenses. Luckily, the Democrats, as Eric said, won the election, making it possible for cities to get federal assistance, for US cities to overcome their deficits, including transit deficits. Still, the decline in the volume of commuting may reduce transit revenues, leading to service cuts and further weakening transit. A decline in the viability of mass transit may accelerate the introduction of autonomous vehicles, for example, as well as reform of urban regulatory regimes to enable autonomous vehicles to operate. So this can go in two different ways. The fourth pattern that we see is the rise of essential workers. The pandemic has redefined work. For cities to continue to function during the pandemic, some people needed to come to work, however dangerous this might have been. We've created a new category of workers, essential workers, those that need to come to work so that cities can continue to function. They are health workers, delivery people, store workers, cleaning crews, transport workers, police and fire crews, caregivers, to name a few. These workers can now realize that they have been empowered by the pandemic. It was generous of them not to strike or rebel during the pandemic, but they can now legitimately organize, unionize, and demand to receive their due. In other words, the pandemic can accelerate the empowerment of workers. Fifth, there's a resurgent interest in public health. During the Pataki and Cuomo administrations in New York State, for example, the state lost 20,000 hospital beds, mainly in communities of color. We've weakened the public in public health through the thorough privatization of hospitals and clinics, leaving us woefully unprepared for the next pandemic. This now needs serious attention. It has become quite clear that pandemics are metropolitan in nature and not restricted to municipalities or to counties. We need a new metropolitan approach to the governance of public health. And finally, and I think Eric mentioned it, there's a rising anxiety about the densification agenda. Concerns with the relationship between density and the pandemic, although imprecise and not evidence-based, will strengthen those who oppose densification, weakening cities' ability to contribute to the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions through densification or to increase affordability through densification. This could weaken effort to change zoning laws so as to enable the construction of multifamily dwellings on single-family plots as already permitted in Minneapolis or in Oregon. It may also weaken the effort to pass a similar law in California that allows for the construction of multi-family dwellings within walking distance of transit stations. In this connection, it is important to increase density literacy among politicians, professionals, and activists to make it clear that the density that contributed to the pandemic, overcrowded multi-generational housing, mass events, crowded transit cars, or crowded bars and restaurants, is not the kind of density we need to increase to make cities more affordable and to combat climate change. The densification we need involves making more room in cities, adding floor space so that more people can occupy the same area without overcrowding them any further. That kind of densification shortens the distance among urban locations and thus reduces vehicle miles traveled. It makes transit more viable by allowing more people to live within walking distance of transit stations, and it makes it easier to walk or bike between locations. This kind of densification, the making room kind, that's the kind that makes cities more affordable without making places within the more crowded, is the kind of densification we need. And it's not in conflict with the density that we're worried about during pandemics. That said, it would be hard to convince anyone that we should make cities denser while the pandemic still hangs over us. Making the right judgments about the future of our cities requires cooler heads. I conclude my remarks by suggesting that cities will come back and thrive again, but that this will take time. 5 years would be a sensible horizon. Seeing clearly what cities will need to thrive again requires patience and a level of clear-headedness that are hard to sustain in the midst of the pandemic. We should be forgiven for not seeing so clearly these days. Thank you.
Thanks, Sal. Very clear and useful. I want to follow up with one question about the decline of retail and office work in central business districts in particular, because it seems to me that if that is a structural change, the prospects of cities regaining their financial footing becomes much weaker. And I wonder if you have, I mean, it's one thing to have the Democrats win control of the Senate and a bailout for, cities that are going to be cash strapped in the short term. But do you have ideas about a kind of long-term fiscal fix that could help cities, regain their economic?
Thank you for the question, Eric. The reason that I say 5 years is that I truly believe that these changes are fundamental and that they're going to stay. The retail, web-based retail has picked up. The number of vacancies has gone up. The discounts to get people to occupy shops has gone up, and the same for office rents. And that I think that is going to be a permanent change. That's the main permanent change that we can see that has been accelerated by the pandemic, because it got people to be more comfortable with the web than they were before. It would have taken us 5 or 10 years to get to this place, and we got there in a year. So I think that, like you say, there will be a fiscal shortfall, and it will take us several years to get back into fiscal health.
It's daunting and but realistic. So let's keep that idea in mind. We're going to shift to Kimberly Johnson. As a political scientist working on cities and metropolitan studies.
Great, thank you. So I think probably most of my comments are going to be in relationship to New York City, but I mean, hopefully we can expand a little bit beyond New York City borders to think about cities in general. I think that there was a lot of change that was happening or in the process of happening even before COVID hit. COVID kind of reset, was a pause, and I think also a reset. So I think the two questions that you posed at the very beginning, are cities over and is New York City over? I would say no, they're not. But what's going to happen kind of post-COVID, I think, is really very interesting. And I think in many ways that COVID moment has provided the opportunity to either strengthen trends that were already underway for good or ill. I think there are probably 6 areas in which we can see either continuation and maybe a sort of intensification of trends that were happening before COVID, or we can actually see a real disjuncture happening. And I do agree that I think the Biden election was a game changer. I think that many of the things that I'm talking about probably wouldn't happen, or would happen under very different circumstances if Biden had not gotten elected. So I think in that sense, Biden's election kind of really opens up the space for cities to really truly begin to grapple with issues that had already been brought up before COVID occurred. So I think probably, in terms of public consciousness, I think that one of the big issues is certainly policing. So policing was a huge issue before COVID happened. Then we had the sort of spring opening up where we actually saw, after sort of a period of reflection, that the COVID pause allowed us, I think people, at the beginnings of a serious conversation, a more intense conversation about policing had occurred, about disparate rates of enforcement and things like that. And so when that sort of early May opening occurred, and we saw that in fact, police treated enforcement of say, wearing a mask differently in say communities of color as opposed to other communities, that kind of set the stage for, oh, wait a minute, right? We can actually see differences in policing, bias in policing actually occur even in a sort of supposedly sort of policy neutral space, which was the pandemic. And then certainly I think George Floyd's death and the sort of Black Lives Matter protests really brought policing into the forefront. And I think what's very interesting is thinking about, we also, in addition to having the Biden election, we're in the midst of a mayoral election, as well as the massive turnover in terms of the city council. And so I think in terms of New York City politics, the sort of status quo ante of policing, the kind of residue, if you will, of stop and frisk is really being challenged. Whether or not whoever gets elected can actually control or kind of figure out a way to kind of deal with the police department is another thing. But I do think that policing has been put onto the agenda, and in an ironic way, COVID kind of allowed for that issue to sort of move up. I think the second issue, certainly that COVID is highlighted, has been education, and certainly equity and inclusion and access to education. So even before COVID, there were debates about particularly the city's segregation. That quite clearly New York City had one of the most segregated public school systems in the United States, which I think really kind of surprises many people. One of the things that COVID does is that it reveals sort of who has the opportunity and the ability to lead the city, either lead the city or exit public schools in favor of private schools, and who doesn't. And so I think that only has sharpened issues around access to quote unquote quality schools, but I think also with the movement to online education, which has not quite worked out, I think, as well as people have sort of always assumed. I think, again, it'll sort of put the issue of what does a quality education mean, and who should it be for, and how many people should have access to a quality public school education. I think the third issue facing not only New York City, but again, all cities, is the issue of housing. We already had an affordability crisis before COVID hit. We still have an affordability crisis, and now we have an eviction crisis. And so one of the things that I think is facing whoever comes into office in June is how do we deal with housing, particularly for the middle and lower parts of the housing market? How do we sort of provide more accessibility to affordable housing? And certainly de Blasio administration has made some moves in terms of rezoning. And it could be that transformations in the city population, work habits, kind of opens up space for new areas of the city to become transformed into more residential areas. Certainly we saw this after 9/11 when the financial district became FIDI, right? And so we might be seeing that in terms of, say, Midtown, particularly Midtown East. And that might be enough to sort of reduce the pressure on areas like the Bronx, which people have been displaced from sort of gentrifying areas, moved up to the Bronx. And so even those kind of affordable areas are increasingly becoming more unaffordable. And then I think probably another issue to think about is economic development. Certainly before COVID hit, we had the famous case of Amazon HQ2 and the sort of community pushback against giving subsidies to large developers or large corporations. I think given the sort of progressive trend that's happened in New York City, that probably hasn't abated. And the growth of Amazon in New York City, despite not having any subsidies or incentives, I think has in some ways proved the critics right, that in some ways New York City and cities in general have some competitive advantages, and one doesn't necessarily need to give away the store in order to promote certain kinds of economic development. But there's other kinds of economic development, which is neighborhoods. And I think this is the real challenge for New York City, is how do we rethink retail in the era of the internet? That retail is really important in terms of neighborhood stabilization, in terms of giving people a sense of safety and community. And I think that this is something that's really valuable. And so the city has really an opportunity to think about how do you promote retail at the neighborhood level and not necessarily protect the interests of chain stores or entities like that. And finally, I think in keeping with what Shlomo suggested, certainly health, access to health, disparities in access to health was one of the highlights that we saw coming out of COVID. And certainly now we certainly see it in terms of vaccination sites, in terms of language accessibility. And I think, again, this is an area in which cities can and should do better. And COVID has really just highlighted that. And then mass transit. I was a former commuter from New Jersey. Our local private bus service has gone under. It's not clear whether it will come back. And so I think there's a real thinking about what does mass transit mean? What is the role of commuter rail in that kind of mass transit funding mix? I think I think I'll kind of leave it at that.
That's great, Kimberly. I really appreciate the way that you have highlighted how the pandemic served as a kind of amplifier or accelerator of trends that have been in New York for some time. They're there before us now. We can see them. We have a kind of an opportunity to engage them, although there's a little bit of a sense that we're overwhelmed by the number of challenges, and they're all expensive to manage. I'm very happy you brought up this issue about neighborhood inequality. I mean, one of the trends in New York City that was unsustainable before the pandemic hit was the kind of runaway affluence of some areas and the immiserated poverty of others that didn't get much attention. We've seen these maps over the last year of which neighborhoods are being hit hardest by the coronavirus, where the deaths are, and then we've seen those maps flip when it came to the vaccine, right? So the neighborhoods that had the least number of cases had the highest concentration of vaccines. So we've seen inequality pronounced there. Do you know, I'm just curious, have we seen yet which neighborhoods have had their local retail sectors, their kind of local small businesses affected most by the pandemic and the economic crash of the past year? Do we already have a sense of which places really need that investment, or is it just obvious and we don't even need the data to know?
I mean, I'm not a leasehold person. I'm not a real estate person, but my sense is that surprisingly, places in the boroughs, the more neighborhood places, that retail has suffered certainly, but I think they've managed to sort of soldier on. I think one of the things that helps is that these are smaller landlords who are more willing to negotiate to keep these businesses in their spaces. So I think it really varies by borough. And I think, if you're at NYU, you sort of look down the street on Broadway and you see sort of all the chains have kind of disappeared. But I don't think that's necessarily the case in sort of in terms of neighborhood retail.
Interesting. Thank you. Well, we're going to jump over the ocean, for part of it at least, and go to the Caribbean. Those of us who've been locked in New York City for the last year wish we could literally do it, but instead we have Vanessa Dean in urban planning and Wagner, who works on Caribbean cities, to kind of open up this discussion. Vanessa?
Thank you, Eric. And yes, happy to take us on a swim over to the Caribbean, a place known for its sun, sand, and sea. Many of us, whether it's the US, whether it's England, Canada, often look to these places as our retreat, right? Our respite. And part of the challenge long before COVID is that what makes these areas in these countries so appealing is part of what also makes them the most vulnerable and at risk to external shocks, be it from the climate, be it something like the pandemic. And so that's sort of where I want to center us today. And both my colleagues did a good job in terms of introducing some of the challenges when it comes to retail, when it comes to economic development. And so I thought it'd be interesting to give us a sense of how this is playing out in a different but related context. So for starters, it always surprises me how very few people know what the region looks like on a map, where we are, a cluster of small island developing states, SIDS. As I alluded to a moment ago, one of the most environmentally vulnerable regions in the world by virtue of its, their smaller sizes, right? Another unfortunate reality is that these small islands have very little to nothing to do with the global carbon emissions that we see, but they're feeling 100% of the impact. So it's not a debate whether or not the sea is rising, temperatures are warmer, hurricane activity being more volatile than it's been in the past. So when it comes to climate and these types of discussion, it's an entirely adaptation conversation versus, mitigating or trying to find a way to curtail any sort of contributions to it. And I intentionally start sort of with this bigger picture because it's very important to understand how we got to where we are before we can assess where we're going from here, right? When you think about the region as well, a lot of people don't look at it in this context, but in a lot of ways, the sort of global capitalist system was born here, right? Going back to the days of Columbus's so-called discovery landing in northern Haiti, what's known today as northern Haiti, and this region having been the #1 sugar producer in the world, tobacco and rum and all of these things. So again, not only is its sort of size making it more susceptible to these shocks and adverse impacts, its economic setup has largely been one that has and continues to be so externally focused and sort of sort of upholding the rest of the world, literally, so to speak. So when it comes to post-colonial spatial development in the Caribbean, you see this common pattern across the region, regardless of whether the colonizer was, Spanish, French, Dutch, whoever, where there was a primate city, typically a port city, where you had this sort of urban core and the rural periphery upholding it in a lot of ways. The idea was, how fast can we get raw material to the port, out on a ship to the rest of the world, right? And so a place like Port-au-Prince, Haiti, for example, at the time of the earthquake a little over 10 years ago, was built for only about 300 to 400,000 people, but was teeming at like 3 million. And a decade later, it's closer to 4 million. And it's not that people, don't have sense or, ignored what happened, but so much of the economic, social, political activity of the country continues to revolve around the so-called primate city in a lot of ways. That makes it problematic when you talk about broader development in other parts of the country and secondary and other tertiary cities. Tourism, again, almost all of these countries, their cities, their whole economies are based on tourism. And so when you're in this position now with the pandemic, where tourism has literally become unsafe, right? And I have a case study about this really briefly. What do you do? Pre-pandemic, you already had an issue of having to rethink tourism-based economies with the natural resource extraction, the beachfronts, the eroding coastlines and all of these issues. And so adding this other layer now will force the sort of reckoning and shifting of how might we look to other types of economic activity to sustain our longevity as a region moving forward. Now, interestingly, because not all places are made equal, right? So you can't kind of paint this broad brushstroke over the entire region, but the case of Bridgetown is an interesting one because unlike I said, a Port-au-Prince in Haiti or like a Kingston in Jamaica and some of the other, major capital cities throughout the region, Bridgetown, the capital of Barbados, has actually been seeing a decline for the past couple of decades in its economic activity. And so I was thinking about, this when Salo was talking about retail activity. You've seen a lot of shopping centers, for example, too, in particular, sort of spring up in more suburban areas. There's less of an incentive to have to drive into Bridgetown for resources that you would have gotten otherwise. It's become a lot more car centric. It's very reliant on, cruise ships docking and people sort of being able to walk it by day, but it's very empty by night. You also see a departure. You can see the buildings here in this picture are as much as possible, still historic. A lot of them have tried to, be preserved over time, but you have a lot of government activities and agencies that have moved out of the city because it costs more to sort of rehab some of these older structures that are colonial structures than it is to build somewhere else. And so the question of how to revitalize downtown was something that was already ongoing. And the Barbados Planning Society, Town Planning Society in particular, has been having a number of conversations and workshops about what might be done. How might we reimagine, Bridgetown? So there are a few interesting initiatives that are happening in terms of place-based activations, trying to appeal to Bayesian nationals versus focusing only on tourists and people who would come into the city to spend, and seeing, just a reimagining. What else might Bridgetown be known for than just this retail activity? So that's something that's quite ongoing pre-pandemic, but certainly post-pandemic will continue to be an interesting conversation. The business district, for example, a lot of the major store owners haven't been a fan of things like walkability and biking. And, they're afraid that if you further decrease car access, it'll sort of do them in. Whereas who knows post-pandemic if there might be greater appeal to that, anything, that might be interesting in terms of helping the climate for sure, but also, again, reimagining how people engage with the downtown core. Now, when it comes to COVID more explicitly, Barbados has been heralded and, just continues to be praised for being one of the leading Caribbean countries and how it's been able to handle the situation. In fact, last summer, it was quite interesting, late July, the Prime Minister and the government announced a one-year tourist visa, welcome stamp, where everyone's working remotely anyway. Why not come and work for a year in Ireland, favorable conditions, whatever have you. as a way to sort of stimulate longer term economic activity beyond your 1 to 2 week vacation. Come for a year, you're going to need to rent a place, you're going to need to, use the supermarket and different things like that as an interesting incentive to get the economy moving. In like days, so many island countries across the world even picked up on this and started implementing something similar. But again, the challenges with having to rely on tourism and external population, up until about December 1st, Barbados had, if I'm not mistaken, less than 400 COVID cases and only 7 deaths. No such thing as community spread, all of 2020. Fast forward to Christmas and a little bit before New Year's, you had massive influx of tourists, primarily from England, a number of people, people from America, from the United States, who came in and just broke protocol. Just were not, adhering to government restrictions, and long story short, left the country with a situation of community spread. As of last night, inching towards 4,000 cases, I think about 3,700. And 44 deaths, which in the grand scheme, compared to a lot of places in the world, not the most terrible thing. However, again, focusing on the small island, small size of these places, a lot of times when you think about resilience as a concept, the ability to absorb shock, to bounce back, to get back to normal as soon as possible, and to adapt to future impacts, they're forced to be resilient by necessity. You already have so many, your resources are so limited, in that you really can't stretch them beyond what they are. And so, as funds have to be redirected now to responding to something like a pandemic, those are funds that are being taken away from climate change. Those are funds that are being taken away from public service delivery and other things at a time that, the global sort of economic system and how it's set up is not as readily willing in a lot of cases to provide financing for more preventative measures. And so some of these countries who may not be as far off as some others in the region, so Barbados is more like a middle income country, are always in this position where you're one disaster, one shock away from undoing decades of progress. And balancing that moving forward is something that will require, in some ways, a restructuring and a reimagining at a geopolitical level with how we relate to different places. And so let's see, my final slide. So thinking about moving forward, because there's so much that I can say on this, it's been interesting to see different hotel establishments, restaurants kind of now start to cater to the sort of national population, right? So now it's not just tourists encouraging Bayesian nationals to take staycations and enjoy places. That's another unfortunate thing that happens in the region. So much of the industry is set up towards outsiders that people who are from the country themselves cannot necessarily enjoy the benefits that are being marketed, for their country. And so that's been an interesting shift of redefining what it means to enjoy a place. And again, especially for those who live there, as I mentioned, I'd like to see globally a reimagining of how we engage with the region, everything from more conscientious tourists and thinking about the impact and the footprint that you're having on these places and their economies, through sort of international settings and creating more room when it comes to climate negotiations, when it comes to these different types of global forums, to have more voice for smaller countries to talk from their firsthand experience and perspectives versus just being the recipient of decisions that are channeling down. And then the final thing is seeing greater interregional coordination. So the region, as similar as it can be in terms of its development, is very varied in terms of, hurricanes and volcanoes and this and that. Seconds before even getting on this call, I got a message that St. Vincent has a very active volcanic situation that might erupt any minute now, and that Barbados is getting ready to receive some of the evacuees. So different types of ways when it comes to greater economic development, climate change response, and otherwise, that countries might work more closely together to pool their limited resources post-COVID. So thank you. Looking forward to engaging more during our time of questioning.
Thank you, Vanessa. I wish we had more time because that was such a rich presentation. I just want to, call out and thank you for making one point that's, I think, so essential here. We frame this conversation as cities after COVID, but of course, if we're going to get to after COVID at very different moments, and once we do get after COVID, we're staring straight into the barrel of climate change or the climate crisis. And I recall from work I've done in this field that there are many people who believe that September 11th set us back 10 to 15 years in our planning and engagement around climate mitigation and climate adaptation, that we had an overwhelming response to September 11th, which was to set up the DHS and to rebuild our cities, to protect against terrorism, and to install all kinds of new security systems and go to war. I mean, it was a major response, and we acted as if the climate issue had disappeared. And the COVID makes it clear that we have to take seriously the threat of pandemic disease, but we can't focus everything on that and forget about climate change. And in fact, that it's clear that there's a relationship between climate change and the risk of pandemic disease because of movement of species and the way that we move and circulate. And so I think you've really forced us to think about what comes next in a broader context. And that's, urgent in the Caribbean, but it's unfortunately also urgent in many other places on Earth, including New York City. So we're going to shift now to Tom Sugru, a historian who teaches metropolitan studies. Let me remind everyone, if you have questions for any of the speakers, please put them in the Q&A now. We'll get to them after Tom's presentation. You're up, Tom.
Great. Thanks very much, Eric. It's always a exciting and a challenge to be the last person in a roundtable because many of the points I want to make have been made by others. And so I'm going to do a little bit of improvisation, looking at the city from the streets. Over the last year plus that we have been dealing with the pandemic here in New York, I've spent a lot of time walking around Lower Manhattan, where I was living through October, and now spending a lot of time walking around parts of Brooklyn, where I'm currently living. What I want to highlight are the ways in which my observations in both Manhattan and Brooklyn have highlighted to me the ways in which what I would call the pre-existing conditions of inequality have continued to play out and have been exacerbated by the pandemic. But let me also suggest an optimistic vantage point from my various peregrinations around New York, which is that I see a real moment of political possibility growing out of the disruptions of 2020 and 2021 that has led in, I think, very promising ways to a rethinking about the relationship of politics and policies to everyday life in the city. So let me start off with my most recent walks around, and then I'll go back to the spring and summer of 2020. But I've noticed in exploring both Manhattan and Brooklyn, and a little bit of Queens, that the parts of the city that were most devastated by the pandemic, that is the neighborhoods that are disproportionately home to those who suffer the pre-existing condition of insecure housing, of precarious employment and poverty, those areas where the pandemic swept through with devastating force, leading to the highest rates of infection in much of the United States, high rates of hospitalization and high rates of mortality, are also the neighborhoods that have experienced the most stability in terms of retail life. So to give one example, I spent a good part of an afternoon recently walking around Sunset Park in Brooklyn, a neighborhood that has two main business districts, one of which is Latin American and predominantly Mexican, the other of which is heavily Chinese. And walking down the streets, there were few signs that that retail is in free fall, that everything is collapsing. In fact, the streets were packed with people, the stores were booming, precisely because the essential workers, who are the core population in those neighborhoods, have not had the resources or opportunity to embark in the online shopping experiments that the rest of us have been doing a lot of. And essential workers have been out working and shopping throughout the entire pandemic, for better and for worse, certainly in terms of exposure to the virus worse. By contrast, spend a few hours walking around Tribeca or Soho or Midtown, particularly the reaches of Midtown as you go around Times Square and up 6th Avenue. It's ghostly, it's empty, it's deserted. I have noticed how empty the streets are in all those places and how many storefronts aren't open, precisely because of what Sally has talked about, the collapse of the indoor office work sector and stay-at-home employment. Jackson Heights, on the other hand, is a place where there's still a ton of activity on the streets. Corona, which was documented by the photographer Camilo Jose Vergara, a highly immigrant neighborhood with lots of essential workers and where the disease hit maybe the worst in the entire city, is a place where there's still a lot of commercial activity and where the subway stations are busy compared to their counterparts in lower Manhattan. So we've got the paradox that the businesses that cater to wealthy tourists, suburbanites, day trippers, and well-to-do residents of the city are the ones that have suffered the most, but those residents have suffered least from the pandemic. And conversely, the business districts that cater to workers, the folks who've been most ravaged by the pandemic, have managed to remain maybe a little more precarious than before, but still relatively robust. One set of observations from the streets. Another set of observations from the streets. In May, June, and some of July and August of 2020, New York was transformed by the greatest wave of protest that's ever happened in a short period of time in American history. This is another view from the streets, but we know from aggregate studies by sociologists like Doug McAdam and others that somewhere between 15 and 26 million Americans took to the streets of American cities, as well as suburbs and small towns during the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. And those huge outpourings of people onto the streets of cities in particular, which were and still are the epicenter of those sorts of social movements, those huge turnouts of people on the street suggest a sort of a prefigurative politics, a new engagement with some of the pre-existing conditions that have proven to be so devastating to residents of our city and of cities around the United States. And I have some optimism about that grew actually out of my encounter with those protests during May, June, and beyond in 2020. The largest wave of protests, as I noted, but also noteworthy for the diversity of those who were out on the streets. As a scholar of the history of social movements, what's striking to me is how few social movements in the past, even moments of mass protest, have been particularly diverse. The civil rights struggle, for example, which we see as an interracial movement, was overwhelmingly led by African Americans. The major protests of the 1960s were largely led by African Americans, happened in African American communities, and targeted leadership. Whereas the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020 have been incredibly diverse, heterogeneous by race, heterogeneous by age, a little less so, and heterogeneous by place in ways that were unimaginable in the 1960s. The diversity of the protesters on the streets that both I observed and other scholars who've done more systemic studies have noted is also matched by the breadth of the demand of protesters. The events of 2020 brought people out angry at George Floyd's murder, targeting police violence and police brutality, demanding either the reform or the abolition of police departments and the change of policing practices around the country. But at every protest that I observed, there were what I would call intersectional activist demands. That is, folks were challenging George Floyd, but also challenging global capitalism. Indeed, many of the more disruptive protests in the summer of 2020 didn't go after, as they did in the 1960s, neighborhood grocery stores, neighborhood markets. They went after multinational chains. And that's true in New York, in Philadelphia, in Los Angeles, and many other cities. But not only were they challenging this dimension of urban life, they were also making demands about such diverse issues as climate change, as transgender rights, as as segregation and unequal education. And there was no protest that I attended that didn't have some pretty robust mix of folks cutting across those different issues and linking them together. That said, one of the big challenges with social movements, and especially large heterogeneous movements with diverse demands, is translating those demands into action on the ground. Institutionalizing protest, bringing it into formal politics, and changing public policies. And here I would have to say that we've seen some very significant possibilities, particularly in major cities. This builds on trends that have been underway for several years now, which is that municipal governments are increasingly becoming sites of policy innovation. And in cities with hidebound political machines or governing coalitions, there's been increasing disruption. That is, city councils in cities I know well, like Philadelphia or Detroit, and of course here in New York, are being challenged by folks coming from the political left. Philadelphia's top vote getter, who came to city council before the COVID crisis, is Helen Gim, a longtime Asian American activist involved in social justice issues. She's far surpassed the other candidates running for Philadelphia city council. Here in New York, of course, we have insurgents running for political office at every level, from state offices down to city council seats. These, to me, suggest the possibility of the institutionalization of those demands. What are those demands, or where are the challenges? I'll just list them because they've already come up in almost every other presentation, which is economic justice, the fight for 15, the demand for better security for essential workers, particularly for workers doing the service sector jobs that remain in the city or are unlikely to go anywhere soon. Housing, particularly challenges to foreclosures and evictions and calls for eviction moratoria. We see action moving from street demands to formal politics. Policing, of course, this may be the most complex one precisely because the police are incredibly powerful, and the demands for abolition, while enjoying great support among street protesters, don't have as much legislative support. This may be the most difficult area to change. And the reinvention of public spaces, something where New York, I think, has fallen behind some of its counterparts around the United States and around the world, but the reimagining of public space in ways that make them more accessible, more environmentally friendly, from bicycle lanes to street closures. Those are just a few. Seeing all of these makes me hopeful that we are at the beginning of a political reorientation in cities, one that might be accelerated by the crises of 2020 and 21, and could open up new possibilities for addressing the myriad pre-existing conditions that continue to hamper the opportunities of residents in our cities. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. You're reminding all of us what a pivotal moment this is and how consequential the things we do are. We obviously observed that in the context of recent elections, and we'll see it in elections that are upcoming. But in all realms of life, one has the sense that there's a weightiness to the decisions that we make, because it feels as if it's not just a once in a generation moment for rebuilding, but maybe, once in a century. Something dramatic is happening. And it's extraordinary to see this kind of surge of activity that you described. And I'm glad you named the protest. The relationship between the protest and the pandemic and the police violence is extraordinary, and something that for all of us to be studying more. Tom, I want to give the other panelists a chance to continue on a thread that you opened up for us, and that is, it's a question that my colleague and friend from France, Valérie November, raised, and the question is, Tom's addressed this, but is there something that has genuinely surprised you that you've observed in the context of the pandemic in cities? There's a way in which we could see the crisis amplifying problems that were there before. but what did you not expect, to happen that has happened in the last year? Any of you could take that.
Well, I'll start by saying that I did not expect protesters to walk past my apartment every day and to hear the thrum of police helicopters late into the night in the posh precincts of Lower Manhattan. That to me was a real surprise. We haven't had a period of that kind of protest, but also that kind of unrest in cities. In close to 60 years, there have been sporadic uprisings and protests, but nothing of the scale. And that shocked me. I really wasn't expecting it. And it was also, I think, a very hopeful moment.
Eric, the thing that surprised me was the level of incompetence in dealing with this pandemic. I really thought that we were much readier. And I think that the reason that what you were saying before was hopeful is that I think that this has rekindled the need for government that has been trodden upon in the last 40 years. So all of a sudden, governance models that work, and I hate to mention the idea that China is now, pushing a model that says, look, we know we govern better than you do. And we have to pay attention. I think that was the thing that the most surprising to me. That started out with the CDC getting it wrong at the beginning, with the tests failing, with a lot of it brought by the the absence of leadership in government. But the level of incompetence in government in dealing with this pandemic was truly surprising to me.
Yeah.
I thought we're better than that.
Yeah. Vanessa or Kimberly, anything that struck you?
I think for me, it was in some ways a repudiation of, I think, a notion that global cities were sort of always going to remain the sort of dominant model. In other words, I was surprised and I think amazed by the solidarity and resilience of neighborhoods. Many people couldn't leave, but maybe people didn't want to leave. And the role of local groups and organizations kind of stepping in to sort of say, hey, we have this crisis, what are we going to do? Well, the sort of elements associated with the sort of global economy, the neoliberal city, those folks kind of left. Capital flat left. But the people who are kind of rooted to the city in a myriad of ways stayed. So I think that really gives me hope that we have a model for resilient cities that doesn't necessarily depend upon sort of certain flows of certain kinds of capital flows.
It's an incredible contrast, isn't it? On the one hand, those scenes that became viral on the internet of people refusing to wear masks in stores during the peak of the pandemic, kind of being more concerned about their kind of individual freedom to do what they wanted to do, and refusing to take the vulnerability of their neighbors seriously, in contrast with the scenes every night in New York and other cities, where when the health workers would come off of work and people would bang pots and pans and applaud. There was this thing that sociologists call collective effervescence happening at the same time that so much of the street life was hollowed out. And in a way, we see both of those models in the US right now, peaking in different places, a kind of solidaristic vision of how we kind of cooperate. And also one that says, the best strategy is to have a truck and to do what you want to do. And I don't know what happens with that clash. Vanessa, did you want to add something, or should we move to another question?
Well, you touched on what I was gonna, mention, but more so in a global context, like the idea of sort of leadership, this collective well-being. Other countries particularly the ones that, as I mentioned, I care most about in the Caribbean region, parts of Africa, were looking at us in amazement, right? The idea that, you know, you look out for your neighbor. Like, I'm not well until my neighbor is well. So of course we're all going to wear a mask. Like, what is this thing that is politicized, or, you know, this class of like individual rights and such, and seeing how that played out, not only on the local level within the country, but globally, and the differential rates of infection and such as a response to that was quite something to watch in terms of what it looks like to be a citizen or a national of a place, and the responsibility that you have to your fellow citizen.
You know, Vanessa, in some ways it's tempting to think of us as kind of winding our way out of the pandemic right now, even though we're in this surge because the vaccine is becoming more readily available in the US. But, you know, of course, you know, as you know so well, the vaccine is really not widely available in most parts of the world. And in a way, the story about kind of solidarity and collective work at the global level is just beginning. And I imagine that to some extent, the way we roll out and distribute the vaccine is going to play a very big role in the rebuilding effort. You know, if we vaccinate 70% of the US, you know, but 15% of Haiti, you know, or Cuba, or, you know, well, Cuba will probably have more, but, you know, if the developing world lacks access to the vaccine, and, you know, not only will there be these variants that will return to the US, but more, you know, urgently, the pandemic will roll on in the developing world. And I wonder how much, you know, this comes up in your conversations in the Caribbean now.
I haven't thought about it exactly in that sense, but it's very much, you know, an issue for sure. As you know, people, like you said, the fourth wave and just ongoing waves, and again, the like how limited resources are not only within, but then also where you would normally reach for help. You know, these larger countries themselves are limited, and in a lot of ways less willing to help, and are trying to sort of push sort of homegrown local resources when those are already stretched. And so it's certainly a thing when you think about the vaccine, and, you know, even if you're vaccinated, you can still be passing it on. But as I mentioned, you know, you rely on tourism to come in. So it's a double-edged sword for sure.
I'm going to ask a few more really specific questions to individual panelists. So Sally, there's a question from Jordan Hare about whether this 5-year forecast for economic recovery that you presented in the beginning, is that a US specific forecast? Are Asian cities, which have done a better job of, you know, protecting themselves and maintaining their economies, are they poised to do much better in this next 5-year period?
It's difficult to make these forecasts anyway. Yes, I was mostly thinking about the US. It's very clear that when you compare it to some other countries that are doing a lot better, like South Korea or China or Vietnam or Thailand, I think their path is shorter than ours. And it's very difficult to know the kind of, you know, right now when you talk to the experts and ask them, you know, when is this over? You get the feeling that it's not over, that it's never over. How is that going to be? How are we going to get rid of this virus when it's globally spread and slowly getting into all these remote places? So we don't really have answers to this question. I think that when you talk about individual countries and how they're dealing with it, US, France, Switzerland, Barbados, yes, we can say something about that. But the virus continues to spread. We still have global travel, business travel, tourism travel, and I'm interested in what Kimberly Johnson was saying before about the hit in the kind of the paradigm of the global cities. I think that this is very real, and that is that the kind of interaction that was needed to sustain the global economy before, saying more contact, more interaction, more connection, is what is keeping this virus spreading. So the reason I'm so reluctant to kind of make judgments now is that we're still in it. This is not, I mean, it's nice to see some light at the end of the tunnel somewhere, but this is not going anywhere.
Thank you. We have another question that I think is interesting from Noelle Liston, and it's about the possibility that we'll start to see some more migration into smaller cities She mentions Pittsburgh and Boulder and Charleston. Some cities, that deindustrialized, Tom, you're obviously a scholar of Detroit, have a lot of, big footprint that's been developed and a lot of physical space that could be reoccupied. Do we think that there's going to be a shift into those places, or do you think COVID's not really a factor for this because people are largely kind of showing interest in big cities again too?
It's really hard to predict the future, and our crystal balls are cloudy on these things. But and Solly can probably speak to this because he's been looking at it in New York. But I don't see inter-urban migration patterns changing very significantly right now. And even the much vaunted flight of New Yorkers, of wealthy New Yorkers to the Hamptons and Westchester and so forth, represents a pretty small shard of the city's population. So I would be even loath to make generalizations about what migration patterns are going to look like within a single metropolitan area. So I'm going to keep my crystal ball really cloudy on this one.
That seemed fair. We have two other questions that are similar to each other, and that they have to do with the way in which we've built up a kind of infrastructure or form of structure that's kind of durable and once planted, difficult to deal with. Bruce Rosen notes that the subway network in some ways really constrains the capacity of the city to bounce back because we have areas that are maybe overly developed in terms of transit, that specifically kind of big commercial areas or business districts. And then Pete Davies makes the point that we really overbuilt retail in city centers, not just New York, but in other cities as well. And that now we have all of this retail and commercial space, much more than what we had decades ago, that can't be converted very easily because of the nature of the space. And I wonder how you see that as being an issue. I know I've spoken to developers in New York City who are really worried about just how little that can be done to change the uses of those hulking office buildings that dominate Midtown and Lower Manhattan. Any thoughts about that?
I can speak to both this question and the last one. I think that Tom is right. We are going to see changes in the distribution of the population within metropolitan areas, but not between. There's no reason for people to move from one metropolitan area to the other, but the moving out has been going on for 100 years, 120 years, and it will continue. In terms of the changes of use, I would think that that cities will find solutions for these things. So that space, built up space, admittedly is difficult to change, but changes. Spaces gets reused. And so I'm hopeful that that problem of kind of filling in vacancies with other uses will be solved.
I want to end the conversation with one last question, which I'm going to direct to Kimberly, and that has to do with the point you made about policing and racial inequality. This is an issue that American cities have grappled with for a very long time. Tom has mentioned that the social movements this summer were extraordinary. Do you see any reason to believe that this is really the moment where we make a meaningful change, that something is about to give, and that American cities are open to thinking about criminal justice differently, thinking about the impact of things like mass incarceration, stop and frisk policing? Are we really at a turning point here, or is this more likely to kind of dissipate and get absorbed like everything else has before?
I'm gonna be optimistic here and actually say that we are at a turning point. How much will it turn is the question, but it is hard to imagine a scenario in which we go back to full-throated support of stop and frisk policing, for example, by major media outlets, with little to no pushback from politicians. I think the nature of who lives in cities, who's voting in cities, who's getting elected has changed so much that I can't imagine us going backwards. How much, I think one of the things that really is going to be a big part of the mayoral election is New York City's economic recovery, but then also the issue of policing. How much sway will the next mayor have over the NYPD? And so I'm hopeful.
I appreciate that. I kind of don't want to add anything to the conversation because it's nice to end the workday on a note of hope. It doesn't happen very often right now, but the truth is that I think you've all made the case that there is something extraordinary happening and some extraordinary possibilities to come out of this in a different place. I regret that we only have an hour. This is a terrific conversation. NYU naturally is a school that's full of terrific urbanists, and I hope that when we all get to go back to our offices, we find a way to keep on working together and debating together and teaching together because we all have a lot to learn. Thanks to everyone for being here. We had a terrific audience tonight. Sally and Kimberly, Vanessa and Tom, I really appreciate you taking time to speak at the forum. Thanks to Sam and Zari and Arivel for providing support to the IPK. And I believe that the next session we have is on the future of social life. We have a great panel with Paul DiMaggio and Natasha Schull and Dana Boyd and Meredith Broussard. We're lucky to be able to get such great minds together. So please sign up for the IPK newsletter. Watch our events on YouTube if you miss them live. And I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye, everybody.